Hi, so Sean Scullion. I was born actually in London, but when I was 2, I moved to Spain. My father used to work for Freddie Laker. Some of you might remember him. But actually, Freddie Laker was actually more famous for his package holidays rather than the transatlantic fight against British Airways, which obviously he lost. Brought up in Spain, bilingual. I was brought up during the dictatorship of Fraco, the latter stages, and I was also there during the transition to democracy. And I had I was very fortunate later on in life to study Spanish at the University of Nottingham. And in a previous life, before I was full-time in the military, I was also a Spanish teacher. I was a lecturer at University of York, and amongst other things. So 8 years ago, I started out on this research trip, and the whole idea is all about Spaniards who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. They were Republicans who had essentially lost the Spanish Civil War, and were going to have to figure out what they were going to do. They were forced to leave their country at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and a lot of them ended up serving in the British Army. In fact, I think there were around 1,200 Spaniards who served in the British Army overall. 1,072 of them are listed in the back of the book, and they were all given regimental numbers, enlisted freely, and volunteered to join the British Army. They weren't forced to do it like many others who were forced to join the French armed forces at the beginning of the Second World War. Now, I quite like this picture. I'm going to zoom in slightly because this picture is quite an unusual picture in as far as the only 2 people who are pulling funny faces, this guy here, they are Spaniards, and they were Spaniards serving in the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment. Rafael Ramos, we'll come across him a bit later on, and Francisco Jerónimo. Now, Rafael Ramos didn't change his name, he called himself Ralph, and Francisco Jerónimo decided to change his name to Frank Williams, of all names. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So where does it all start? Well, it all actually starts, let me just see if this is working. Here we go, slide 1, try that. Okay, so it all actually starts at the end of the Spanish Civil War. And there's the well-known story of a thing called La Retirada, the big withdrawal, the withdrawal of the Republican forces into France, having lost the Spanish Civil War. The 1st of April 1939 was when the Spanish Civil War was declared finished by Franco, and you had over 450,000 Republican Spaniards forced to flee the country, of which about 200,000 were men of a fighting age. So they cross over the border into France, and they're forced into internment camps. They were actually called campos de concentración, concentration camps at the time, and some of them were pretty horrendous. Quite a few also managed to escape across the Mediterranean to North Africa, and they were all interned in these camps from January 1939 onwards, and some of them remained interned for quite some time. And you can see some harrowing photos here. This is quite a famous photo of a little girl crossing the border. She doesn't have a leg. You've got some of the photos here of some of the groups crossing the Pyrenees. And we get to the spring, summer of 1939, and the Spaniards who are left in the camps, the Spaniards of a fighting age, they have to make some choices, and they're given various options by the French authorities. French authorities don't really know what to do with them, but with war looming, they realise that they probably can make best use of these men of a fighting age. So they give them 5 choices. The first choice is you can go back to Spain. Well, of course, they were never going to do that. The second choice is they can work in the armaments industries and in agriculture, supporting the French war machine. The third option is they can serve in foreign labour companies. And you've got a couple of ID cards here. This is what Eduardo Tamarit and Antonio Obis. These 2 members here are covered later, and they are going into some detail of those 2 individuals in the book. That's their ID cards as members of Spanish, foreign labour companies in the French armed forces, a bit like the pioneers. They were interned in camps. A lot of these camps had to be improvised, basically built on the sand, on the beach across the border from Spain. And couple of these camps were quite famous. Bacarés was a famous camp, and Bacarés was a big camp which was pretty much all entirely made up of Spaniards of a fighting age. And those Spaniards in that camp often had recruiting groups from the French Foreign Legion. And you can see here Francisco Geronimo, we were talking about him earlier, Frank Williams. That's him signing up and becoming a French Foreign Legionnaire. Photos taken in North Africa whilst he was carrying out French Foreign Legion training. And also, the final option that they were given is they could also join what they called foreign volunteer marching battalions. And there were about 15,000 foreigners who were recruited into these marching battalions. Over 5,000 of those were Spanish. There's a small photo here, a group photo here, of a group of them joining those one of those battalions. And obviously, they're in this French war machine, and by a certain point, i.e. the beginning of the Second World War, September 1939, everything starts to change. And it's at this point that we start to get Spaniards joining the British. The first big wave of Spaniards that joining the British Army do it in 1940. And we've got two groups mentioned on this slide here. You can see, for example, here at the bottom left-hand corner, you've got a group of Spaniards with their British officer, Captain Smith, MC, Pioneer Corps, and they are members of 185 Spanish Labour Company. And the Spanish Labour Company was a company that was formed out of one of the concentration camps, one of the internment camps in Gurs, near Bayonne, and it was made up. The company was made up of about 240 Spanish Republicans. Most of them were members of the Republican Air Force that had been placed into that camp. That camp was an interesting camp because it had three main groupings. It had members of the International Brigades who'd been fighting in the Spanish Civil War, who were foreigners. They were placed in one part of the camp. Another part of the camp was all Basques, so there's quite a lot of stories of Basques being placed in there. And then the others were Republican Air Force, and these men were mostly from the Republican Air Force. And the reason why 185 Spanish Labour Company is established in December 1939 is because the British Expeditionary Force has arrived in France, and it needs labour to support it. So 185 Spanish Labour Company starts working and is based in Saint-Nazaire in Lower Brittany, and is continuing to serve and support the British Expeditionary Force all the way through until June 1940. It's also in the summer of 1940 that you get the biggest enlistment of Spaniards into the British Army who have been serving in the French Foreign Legion. And they form the #1 Spanish Company, which you can see there on the flag. That's their pendant, quite an interesting pendant. They've got the Pioneer Corps colours, the green and the red. Sadly, exactly the same colours as the French Foreign Legion, but never mind. And also you can see here the three colours, the red, the yellow and the purple of the Spanish Republican flag, which is obviously the cover of the book. And these are all men who have signed on to join the French Foreign Legion for the war. And they are sent as members of the 13th Half Brigade to Narvik. They fight in Narvik in April-May 1940. And then they are then withdrawn from there to fight in France, and then end up on the 20th of June in Plymouth, the same day as 13 members of 185 Labour Company have managed to escape from France and arrive in Plymouth as well. Quite an amazing story. Now, the 13 members of the 185 Spanish Labour Company, not all 13 joined the British Army, but some of them do end up working in armaments factories in Birmingham, in the Midlands and things like that. It's quite an interesting story because they arrive in Plymouth, and they're then, obviously we're all engineers there, they get looked after by what is now 29 Commando Artillery Regiment, and they get looked after by them in the Citadel, by barracks as we know well, and they end up volunteering to help out in the kitchen because they feel so guilty. They've been looked after so well by the forces there. And every couple of days, the soldiers from the regiment chip in some money for them to be able to buy food, and, well, not buy food because they get food for free in the canteen, but go to the NAFI, buy cigarettes and things like that. So it's quite a touching story. The men in 185 Spanish Labour Company that make it to the UK that enlist into the British Army in July 1917. At the same time, over 200 Spaniards from the 13th Half Brigade do that as well, because they've landed in Plymouth on the 20th, the same day. They don't meet up, they don't know each other, they don't know they're in the same harbour, they're on different ships. But they're part of the French Foreign Legion that have been in Narvik, moved to France and then land in Plymouth. And what ends up happening is that they realise that the French have signed the armistice and they need to basically leave. As far as they're concerned, the French have lost the war. They want to leave the French armed forces. So a lot of them refuse to soldier from that point onwards. Some of them are then incarcerated, and there's a large group of them that are incarcerated. Over 300 of them carry out a sit-down protest during a parade. A few days later, when the brigade the Half Brigade is moved to Trenton Park near Stafford, they end up having a visit from de Gaulle, drumming up for the Free French on the 28th of June, and the 300 or so Spaniards sit down protest, lay their weapons down, refuse to soldier. They are then arrested, sent to Stafford prison, and on the 1st of July, half of the brigade have decided that they want to join the Free French, the other half have decided they're going to go back to Africa, and the Spaniards are told they're going to join them. They don't want to do that. There's a bit of a confrontation at Avonmouth Harbour near Bristol, and the French say, well, we're going to shoot one out of every three pour encourager les autres, and the British authorities step in, and all the members of the 13th Half Brigade that join the British Army enlist on the 17th of July. Now, the story of the company then becomes quite an interesting one. The company lands in Normandy in August 1944 and ends up being a forestry company for the rest of the war. But for the next kind of 3 years, over 100 members of the No. 1 Spanish Company end up being trained by the Special Operations Executive to fight behind enemy lines in the Iberian Peninsula should the Germans invade Spain and try and capture Gibraltar. And it's quite an interesting story. They are visited in their barracks in Plymouth in early December 1940. Hugh Quinnell, the head of H section, that's the name of the section in the Special Operations Executive that deals with the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and a series of teams. There are 6 teams in total that end up being trained as SOE agents. In total, there's probably about 140 Spanish who are trained as SOE agents. Around 120 of those are from the No. 1 Spanish Company. We've got a couple of characters in there. You've got Manuel Espallargas here, and you've also got Jose Garcia. We'll come across those two a bit. Manuel Espallargas, really interesting character. You can see him here in the photo, kind of seen there. And that's the only group photo we have of the Spanish agents. They were given the name sconces, and their training officer for the first year was Kim Philby, who was an agent and training officer for the Special Intelligence Service. And the person who wrote the orders for them, carried out the planning for the potential operations in the Iberian Peninsula, was Ian Fleming. So, quite a hallowed company. They also probably came across David Niven when they were in Scotland, when they went to their commando training, because David Niven was trained as a commando as well, served in the Special Forces. And they also came across a couple of other characters, one of them being a man called Peter Kemp. And Peter Kemp was a very interesting character. He was training for the bar after having done law at Cambridge just as the Spanish Civil War broke out. An ardent anti-communist, decided to join Franco's army and served in the Spanish Foreign Legion during the Spanish Civil War. Injured twice in battle, returned to Britain, and he was interviewed personally by Franco at the end of the Spanish Civil War, returned to Britain, war broke out, joined the British Army, transferred to the Special Operations Executive, and was going to be a team leader of some of these Spaniards. And so I don't think they would have kind of let him off the hook. He probably wouldn't have survived very long on any of the operations should they taken place. Most of the operations were cancelled, so actually we're talking about only about 20 to 30 of the 120 or so members of the Spanish No. 1 Company being involved in operations, mostly as radio operators with the Free French and with the Maquis and Resistance in the summer of 1940, shortly after or shortly before D-Day. One of those people was a man called, I don't know if you were watching Channel 4 Film on 4 yesterday. I was watching Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones was up yesterday. And you might remember that first scene in Indiana Jones where he swaps the golden head with a sack of sand, and then he gets chased by a big round stone. Well, the South American guy who's with him is a guy called Alfred Molina, and he's quite famous. He becomes a Hollywood actor later on, and he's quite famous for being in The Octopus with the big tentacles. Well, his father was Esteban Molina, who's in this photo here. That's Esteban Molina there. And Esteban Molina stayed in Britain and married an English girl, then divorced, married an Italian girl, and then had the son, Alfred. So there's quite a few interesting connections there with the No. 1 Spanish Company. And of course, at the end, in 1943, when it's decided not to use them, they rejoin the company. The company then does training for Normandy. It then deploys. It becomes a forestry company. It's mostly based in the Ardennes, September 1945 to September 1944 to September 1945. It's pushed up towards Belgium, and it operates out of a little chateau, which I managed to track down. It's the Ghanaian, not the Ghanaian embassy, it's the Ghanaian consulate now, in the middle of nowhere in the forest in the Ardennes. And they carry out a lot of forestry tasks, mostly providing wood for Bailey bridges, for the decking and things like that. So they have their own cutting, and then they have their own sawmill that they establish and everything else. So that's the No. 1 Spanish Company. At the same time as the No. 1 Spanish Company being established in the summer of 1940, you have another wave of Spaniards joining the British Army, and this time in the Middle East. And these are people who become members of the Middle East Commandos. There are 63 Spaniards who end up joining No. 50 Middle East Commando, which is established in August, September 1940. But I've also found there are others who join the other Middle East Commando units. And these are mostly men who've escaped from the French Foreign Legion and from the foreign marching battalions in modern-day Syria and Lebanon, serving with the French. They have exactly the same situation as the No. 1 Spanish Company members. Get to June 1940, they don't want to serve with the French anymore. The French have lost. They want to be part of the British Army. They want to serve under the British Army. Quite a lot of the French officers want to do the same, but the decision is made by the senior officer in the Levant that the French are going to side with Vichy. And that kind of comes back to haunt the French, because we then get a series of battles that take place in the Middle East between the British Army, or the Allies, let's say, and Vichy French in 1941. And of course, the Vichy forces lose that and end up becoming Free French. And the irony, of course, is that some of the Spaniards who end up staying in the French Foreign Legion end up serving in the French Foreign Legion just before El Alamein. So even though they don't escape to the British, they end up serving with the British just before El Alamein. It's quite an interesting story. But what happens to these men is they start there. They're the first volunteers to join the newly established Middle East Commandos. And there's some really, really interesting characters in the gang there. No. 50 Middle East Commando ends up going to Crete briefly before Christmas 1940, and then it gets sent out to Crete at the end of May 1941 to be part of the Battle of Crete. And the day they land, the night they land, it's realised that the island they're withdrawing from the island. The Allies are drawing from the island, and they use the commandos as the rear guard of the rear guard to defend the force as it's withdrawing to the south coast of Sfakia. And in that rear guard action, half of the Spaniards are taken captive. There's a couple of photos here, group photos of some of the Spaniards as POWs. The guy here with a cocked hat, quite an interesting character. His name was Barroso, Manuel Barroso, and his son came to the National Army Museum last Friday, a larger-than-life character, a bit like his dad, but I don't think as dodgy. And I'll say why, because he joined the French Foreign Legion in 1939 because he got involved in he was a white slaver, basically he was a pimp, in Paris. Realised his kind of numbers were up a bit, so he joined the French Foreign Legion, ended up in Syria, part of the group that crossed over to the British, joined the British Army, fought in Crete, was captured, became very good with his fists as a boxer in the POW camp, ended up as a heavy for a Maltese mafia in Soho in the 50s and 60s, and did 2 terms in Wormwood Scrubs as a consequence. And his son Pierre's been brilliant, but you just never know, do you? So, but his sister was really nice, but just kept telling him to shut up last Friday as they were recounting me lots of stories. But obviously, all these people were larger-than-life characters in many ways. What happens, though, is, of course, half of the Spaniards don't get captured in Crete. And this is where the story gets really interesting. And you can see a small group photo here and another photo here. And by the way, this man here, Manuel Sureda, as his name is, his grandson is the person that designed the front cover of the book. I'm very proud to do it. He's a graphic designer. And Manuel Sureda married a girl from Preston and settled just outside Preston. There's a little gang of them that settled up in the northwest. Another one settled in Blackpool as well. The Middle East commandos had a really interesting uniform. They didn't use the commando dagger. They used a special dagger called a fanny. It had a knuckle duster handle and it was a larger blade. And if you can see, the cap badge is on their slouch hats. You can also see it there. And you can also see it on the tam o' shanter here. This photo is a later photo. This is after Crete, and the reason why, before Crete, they used to wear the slouch hats and things like that. As you can see here, slouch hats, slouch hat. After Crete, they tended to wear the tam o' shanter, and that's because after Crete, they then became, the Middle East Commandos were established in an organization called One Special Service Regiment, which is the precursors to the SAS, the SBS, the Long Range Desert Group, things like that. So it's quite an interesting story. And those Spaniards are heavily involved in that part of the world, involved in operations. We don't know for sure, but it's fairly likely that there were Spaniards involved in Operation Flipper, which was the operation to try and capture or kill Rommel. Half of the members of the operation were able to land on the beach, the other half weren't. And it's fairly likely the half that weren't contained mostly Spaniards. Their submarine couldn't surface properly, so they couldn't get out on the dinghies and get to the beach, which basically meant that the whole operation went downhill anyway. There were only 3 survivors on that operation, so then we might not have had some of these Spaniards being able to tell us their story if they had not made it. Well, going back to the prisoners of war, though, and this is quite an interesting development here. If you look here, you've got a little document in the middle, and you might just notice the word Gibraltar there. And the medical officer of the commandos, the Middle East Commandos, number 50 Middle East Commando, he is Archie Cochrane. He's a Royal Army Medical Corps officer. He has been a doctor in the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. He speaks quite good Spanish. And as the prisoners are being processed in Thessaloniki, because they get moved around quite a bit, they get to Thessaloniki, and that's the main processing point where they're going to be going through all the details and filling in all the forms, load up team forms. The Spaniards are all absolutely paranoid about being sent back to Spain or being killed or something like that. So he just says, got a really good idea. Why don't you tell everybody you're Gibraltarian and then you're British and you'll get away with it. So all of their paperwork says that they are Gibraltarian, and it's quite an interesting story. We've also got characters like this guy here, Moisés Trancho Bartolomé. Now, Moisés Trancho Bartolomé, he's a professional footballer during the Spanish Civil War, well, just before the Spanish Civil War. He's from outside Bilbao, and he fights in a militia initially at in the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, and then he is a soldier, becomes a corporal. He gets his little finger blown off. Shot off on his right hand, and that's how I've been able to find him in the group photos, because you always look for the guy with no little finger on his right hand. He is automatically made a corporal, becomes a sergeant straight away, and he's singled out as the toughest of the Spaniards who are commandos. An amazing story. And one of the reasons why it's one of these tough individuals is because during the Spanish Civil War, when he loses his finger, he doesn't need to fight on anymore. He's discharged from the army, but he re-volunteers to join another battalion. He fights in the north of Spain. He gets married. His wife has a baby. They embark on a ship. That ship gets torpedoed. He carries on fighting. He then becomes a prisoner of war. And then he manages to escape across the Pyrenees, joins the French Foreign Legion, and ends up in the Middle East Commandos. And he is, when he was able to get across to the Pyrenees into one of the internment camps on the French side, they used to release him from his camp to play football for Bayonne, which was in the 2nd Division. And you know, the story kind of goes on from there. So some cracking stories there. And sadly, Moisés Trancho Bartolomé, his wife and his child never made it, but he had 2 older brothers. They both made it, and both fought in the Free French. And they were, ironically, held in Gurs camp, which is what I was telling you about earlier, as Basques. And they both fought in the Free French. And the son of one of those brothers contacted me 3 weeks ago to start talking about his uncle, because obviously didn't know the story. So I'm able to tell the story of these people to family members in order to make sure that they really understand, how these men fought. The sad thing about Moisés Trancho Bartolomé is it would seem that he was severely wounded in action in Sicily in 1943, and he died of his wounds about a month later. We don't really know the circumstances of his death. We do know that he was seen as the best soldier out of all of them. It's an incredible story. And that's him in his football shirt, by the way, playing football in one of the camps in France. Okay, the biggest wave of Spaniards joined the British Army, over 700 joined the British Army in North Africa in 1940, end of 42, 1943, after the Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch as it was called, happened in November 1942. Now, there were about 15 or so thousand Spaniards who were interned in camps in North Africa just at the end of the Spanish Civil War. But then when Vichy was established, what ended up happening was a lot of the undesirables, the more politically kind of focused people, were moved from camps in France to North Africa. So we're talking about over 20,000 Spaniards being held of a fighting age, very politically kind of focused people being interned in camps. And one of the worst camps was a camp called Gelfa, and you can see a photo of them here, of a group of people in that. And the guy with the pipe and the kind of safari hat is this guy here, Antonio Obis. He married a girl in Coventry and settled down over there. And his son has been very supportive in providing lots of really interesting photos. Really interesting one is this photo here, and I can't really blow it up more, but you can see here, this is a black African man. He is actually from Equatorial Guinea, which was a Spanish colony, and he fought in the Spanish Civil War, escaped across to North Africa, was then interned, and his name was Eduardo Fineboy, and he settled 2 doors down from Antonio Obis in Coventry. Amazing stories. So 700 or so Spaniards enlist into the British Army once they've been released from the internment and concentration camps in North Africa. Quite a lot of them have been working in penal colonies, the Trans-Saharan Railway, or they've just been held in these labour colonies in North Africa, from Morocco all the way to Tunisia. And it's quite an interesting story. You've also got quite an important character here called Agustin Roaventura. Now, Agustin Roaventura was in Gelfa camp. He was an ardent anarchist. And after the war, he settled in Britain. He was actually a copywriter for the Times and for the Sun, because he had an editing background. And he ended up settling in London, North London, in fact, just outside Luton. And he then settled down in Britain. And he is the main reason why I've been able to find out so much, because he's a huge chronicler of what the Spaniards got up to. And he was one of the people who established the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association, which I'll talk to you about in a bit. And of course, I couldn't go without talking about the Spaniards who served in the Special Air Service. And I've actually tracked down over 15 Spaniards who served in the Special Air Service. 8 of them served together in 2nd SAS, and the others served in 3rd and 4th SAS. 3rd and 4th SAS, I mean, you heard Andy earlier, some of you. 1st SAS had a new recruitment drive in early 1944 and was able to get most of its members from Britain. 2nd SAS did have some foreigners. Those foreigners were called funnies, and they made up a squadron, D Squadron, in 2nd SAS. And they weren't just made up of Spaniards, they were made up of some French, some Germans, some Eastern Europeans, even a few White Russians. And these were all people who'd served in the French Foreign Legion, who joined the British Army in the autumn or early 1943, end of 1942 into 43, and then went for SAS selection and became members of the SAS. And we'll come back to the story now of this guy here, Francisco Jerónimo, Frank Williams. So he's involved in several operations behind enemy lines in France in 1944, and then along with this guy here, Rafael Ramos, okay, and you can just see his face in the gap between these two photos. This guy with a cigarette in his mouth, that's a guy called Justo Valerdi. Justo Valerdi, sadly, is killed on Operation Tombola in April 1945. But these guys, they're fighting behind enemy lines, and they're doing lots and lots of really, really mad things. Tombola is a huge example of how these men have this amazing endurance, and Rafael Ramos is one of those This is a photo of Rafael Ramos taken whilst training partisans in northern Italy. And Rafael Ramos, what he does is he enlists in North Africa in 1943, Pioneer Corps initially, transfers across to the SAS, does SAS selection, and within a few months in early 1944, he's in Britain with 2nd SAS, and he goes on the Operation Tombola. He's on the same operation as Francisco Geronimo and Justo Valerdi. Justo Valerdi, by the way, changes his name to Robert Bruce. All the Spaniards in the SAS changed their names because they wanted to make sure that they were not going to get in trouble or they were not going to be sent back to Spain. And of course, the commando order had been signed by this point, so they knew they were probably pretty doomed. And the story goes that they were doing their final parachute training. Most of them had done parachute training in North Africa, but quite a lot of them went to Ringway in Manchester to carry out the remainder of their parachute training, which is the main parachute training centre, the parachute training school. And what ended up happening was that at the end of that, they were in the NAFI or a bar, depending on who you are, depending on how you want to bend the story. And the Spaniards all decide they need to change their names. But Rafael Ramos refuses to, so they just call him Ralph. And the others change their names. So this is where this guy comes in, Angel Camarena, Angel Camarena, as the British would call him, obviously. Angel Camarena, his first name is actually Higinio, which is a bit of a mouthful, so they called him Angel instead. And he changed his name to Alan Cooper. But they all changed their names. But Francisco Geronimo actually wants to be called Francis Drake. But that doesn't really work. And this kind of harpens back to some of the language problems that the Spaniards have. A lot of the Spaniards who end up joining the British Army in North Africa, and you'll see this in the book, it's in chapter 5, there are whole episodes of officers commanding, majors commanding pioneer companies made up of Spaniards, and they're having to communicate in German or in French in order to then communicate with the Spanish, because the Spanish couldn't speak English, but they could speak French. It was an absolute nightmare. But it worked, and these Spaniards were really good at doing stuff behind enemy lines, and these three, Angel Camarena was on another operation, but Francisco Geronimo, Rafael Ramos, and Justo Valerdi went on Tombola. And on Tombola, we have Rafael Ramos being awarded an immediate military medal for fighting in one of the attacks they make during that operation, where they attack a Corps headquarters, trying to basically kill all of the German officers in the Corps headquarters. The commander's not there, the chief of staff is, they kill him, and Rafael Ramos is personally responsible for killing 6 German officers single-handedly. He then rescues an officer who's been injured by a fragmentation from a grenade, carries him out, goes back in, carries on fighting, and then at the end of the battle, he puts this injured officer on a ladder, and with another SAS trooper, he escapes and evades German capture for 3 days in the mountains, 2 foot of snow, and gets an award and a military medal by Roy Ferran, quite a famous SAS officer, and he wrote him off straight away for it. Rafael Ramos settles down in Exeter at the end of the war, marries a Czechoslovakian who'd been saved by a ballet dancer and managed to get to Britain at the end of the war. And he settled down in Exeter, but sadly dies of cancer in 1960. And his daughter, Cristina, has been really, really, really supportive. One final talk about the Spaniards and the SAS is this guy here, Angel Camarena, and this is his officer. He's actually a French-Canadian officer, and Angel Camarena is a bit of a survivor as well. He actually decides to join the Spanish army before the Spanish Civil War, and he joins the Corps of Engineers, good lad. He joins the Corps of Engineers and becomes a driver, an MT driver. But the thing about he's not just any MT driver. He gets sent to the Canary Islands, and he's based out of Tenerife, Santa Cruz de Tenerife. And in January 1936, before the Spanish Civil War kicked off, they had the final elections that basically made the generals decide that they were going to carry out a coup, which failed, that then became the Spanish Civil War. And the Spanish Republican government that had been voted in those elections early in 1936 decided to send Francisco Franco Belmonte, Franco becomes dictator of Spain, to become the governor of the Canary Islands, based in Santa Cruz de Tenerife, with a chauffeur pool. And Angel Camarena becomes his chauffeur. So, imagine the scene. he is waiting for Franco to come out of his office every now and again, and he is there swinging Franco's daughter. Franco only had one daughter. Swinging Franco's daughter in the swing and waiting for the general. Civil war, the coup starts. The civil war then breaks out fully later on in the year. Ángel Camarena is immediately arrested as an anarchist sympathizer. He's placed in a prison ship because they arrested so many people in the Canaries. They ran out of cells, so they commandeered all these fruit ships, Fife and Co. The banana people and all that. They took all these ships, put prisoners in them. The day he's going to be shot, because he's condemned to death, he's one of 21 people is going to be shot. The day he's going to be shot, he's on board, out on deck, and they're going to shoot him, and he dives into the sea, swims over to a British ship. The British then hand him over back again to the Spanish authorities on the proviso he's not going to be executed. And this is all documented. This is all documented. This is an incredible story. And then he manages to escape death, and he's then put in a penal colony in Morocco until 1941. He then revisits his family, realizes he's probably on a hit list of some sort. North Africa happens. He joins the British Army Pioneer Corps in 1943 and then goes to do SAS selection. And he ends up living 2 doors down from Francisco Geronimo on a street in Swansea after the war. Because all the SAS guys, apart from Rafael Ramos, all settled down on the same street in Wales, in Swansea. It's quite an amazing story. So there you go. There's a little bit about the SAS there. And a couple of individuals to talk about as well. I've had the privilege of interviewing over 70 families during the course of this book, and about 40 of the families so far have come to some of these events for the launch of the book this last 10 days. And one of those individuals there, he had 2 sons, and his name is Fernando Esteve. This is Fernando Esteve, bottom right-hand corner. Fernando Esteve, French foreign legion, Syria, escapes, joins the Middle East commandos, fights in Crete, escapes, decides he's not going to transfer to another unit in the same kind of way, decides to join the infantry and signs up for the 1st 5th Queen's Battalion, West Surrey, lands in Salerno in September 1943, fights at Volturno, and along with this guy here, Josep Villanova, the 2 of them are involved in a raid stroke patrol, crossing the Volturno River. Josep Villanova, he's Catalan, so is Esteve. Josep Villanova is awarded an immediate military medal for saving a patrol and taking out machine gun nests. He's so badly injured that he doesn't continue serving anymore. But Fernando Esteve does. And the 7th Armoured Division, which is what the battalion was part of, then gets moved to Britain, lands in Normandy just after D-Day, and he fights in the same battalion all the way through to Hamburg at the end of April 1945, and he's at the Victory Parade in Berlin in July 1945 as well. And he ends up becoming a really well-known seafood chef in a restaurant called Le Caprice in London. Princess Diana, Rolling Stones, that kind of thing. And he's like the seafood chef. It's an incredible story. And his 2 sons came to the embassy on Thursday. It was really good to have them there. A couple more stories. There's some tragic stories, of course. A lot of these Spaniards are killed and die in action. 2 of them who do, or 3 of them who do, you can see the graves at the top there. I'm going to work my way around. You've got these 2 here, José María Irala and Lucio Sauquillo Echavarría. The first 2 are actually Basque refugee children. During the Spanish Civil War, Britain agreed to take 4,000 refugee children from the Basque country in 1937, and they arrived by ship with all of their teachers and their nurses and all that. No immediate family, just the children and their helpers. They settled in Britain during the rest of the Spanish Civil War. By the time the Second World War broke out, there were about 400 to 500 of them still left in the country. They didn't have any families to go back to, so they stayed. And several of the men, they're then men, because obviously a lot of them got to be 20, 21, 22, volunteered and enlisted into the British Army. And 2 of them sadly died, killed in action. One was José María Irala, like I said. He joined the Reconnaissance Corps and died nearly 20 years to this day in Arnhem. Sorry, nearly 80 years to this day in Arnhem. And the other one is Lucio Sauquillo Echevarría, who volunteered to join the parachute regiment. He was based in Scarborough and had been training to be a mechanic. And he volunteered and joined REMI, oh dear, and then he transferred to the parachute regiment, and he was killed at the Battle of Breville 4 days after D-Day. Ironically, I've also found that there were some Spaniards who joined the Irish Guards. Kind of makes sense, really, you know, kind of Catholic thing, I guess. And there's about 4 or 5 of them I found in those Irish Guards. One of them was killed on the other side of the river at Arnhem. So Marcial Fernandez, he was in one of the battalions, the Irish Guards battalion, as the Guards division was trying to push towards Arnhem to relieve Arnhem in September 1944. And the final one I wanted to mention was this man here. This guy's a real character when he comes to the onesies and twosies, and that is Alfonso Cánovas. Alfonso Cánovas, he was a guy who actually lived in southern France when he was a teenager because his parents moved to southern France in the 1920s to find work. They all returned to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, but then when the war broke out, they went back to France. Of course, they had nowhere else to stay. And he volunteered, crossed over to Northern Africa, volunteered, joined the Pioneer Corps, but then volunteered to become a member of the Special Operations Executive. And then they found out that he actually knew South France really well, of course, because he'd been brought up there, and he could speak fluent French. And his nickname was the English Sergeant. I don't know why, because he couldn't speak English, but that's what they called him. Anyway, he parachuted in on a small mission, the Aube mission, A-U-B-E mission, in early August 1944, and he was part of the liberation of the town of Foix, also Montauban, and he was involved in action in Toulouse. And in the liberation of Foix, he was injured and was awarded an immediate military medal for his actions. He was promoted to immediate sergeant and then transferred to the parachute regiment, and then was involved in a couple of operations toward the end of the war and was actually going to be part of a team that was going to be parachuted into Japan. But obviously that never happened. Then he met a girl from Blackpool and settled down and set up a little B&B in Blackpool. And his grandson is a sound director and was sound director on The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Lives in New Zealand. Quite an incredible guy, a bit of a hippie, lives in the mountains, but a really generous guy with his time and everything else. I've been very, very fortunate to speak to all of these families. So what happens at the end of the war? Well, of course, the majority of the Spaniards who end up in Britain at the end of the war, who've been fighting the British Army, feel extremely let down by Britain because they thought that Britain and the Allies would go after Franco next. There's a lot of politics thrown in there, of course. It's all about pragmatism and everything else, but the decision is made not to go after Franco for various reasons. And I talk about that in the book a bit as well. But a lot of these Spaniards have to settle down. And out of the 1,200 or so Spaniards that I'm fairly sure served, about 600 to 700 settle in Britain, which is really, really good. And you can see some of the photos here. Here's Francisco Jerónimo. He ends up marrying a Basque refugee child who settled in Britain after the Spanish Civil War. And here is Ralph Ramos with his Czechoslovakian wife. And then Jose Garcia meets a girl from Poplar and settles in the East End of London and ends up working as a fruit and vegetable importer-exporter. He actually starts off as a French polisher and then ends up doing that. And his daughter Sarah is in Australia at the moment and has passed me on quite a lot of the interesting photos. This is quite an interesting photo here because this photo shows half of the Spaniards in this photo were made prisoner of war in Crete and the other half survived. And this is them meeting after the war with their cleaner uniforms on, with their medal ribbons and their parachute wings on and everything else, all meeting up at the end of the war. It's quite an interesting one. This is a guy called Joaquin Fajardo. He was a prisoner of war, and his son Tony's been really, really helpful and supportive. Joaquin Fajardo ended up becoming an ardent Chelsea supporter at the end of the war. Okay, some of us have crosses to bear, I guess, but the reason why he became a Chelsea supporter is because when he got liberated from the prisoner of war camp in April 1945, he was sent back to Britain. Never been in Britain. So these prisoners all of them had never been in Britain. So it was all a bit of a culture shock to them. But he was used for prisoners of war and AWOL escorting duties because obviously he was a trained commando. So they knew he would be able to kind of grapple somebody to the ground and do what they needed to do. So he got to visit all of Britain and Northern Ireland, tracking these people down or escorting them or whatever. And he always used to go and try and see a football match. as well, because he was transferred to the Pioneer Corps in that year, but he's actually wearing his Queen's Royal Regiment cap badge, because he was proud of being an original Queen's Royal Regiment, because when the commandos first joined the British Army, they were put on the books of the Queen's Royal Regiment before they became members of the Middle East Commandos. But he became a Chelsea supporter because he went to the famous football match between Dynamo Moscow and Chelsea at the end of 1945, supposedly a really famous match. It doesn't flick my switch, and then he became an ardent, and he settled in World's End, just off the King's Road, and his family, and he married a Portuguese girl, and his son and his 2 grandsons have all met up with me this last couple of weeks. It's been brilliant. But the Spaniards also set up their own ex-servicemen's association, and you can see here the badge, the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association. A bit controversial, obviously, because they're using the Spanish Republican flag, but it became quite political as well. And they carried out a series of protests in the late 50s all the way through to the mid-70s. And the photo you can see in the bottom right-hand corner is quite an interesting photo, because it was only taken 3 weeks before Franco died. And it is the Spaniards laying a wreath at the cenotaph, being given permission to do that, laying a wreath at the cenotaph for their fallen comrades. But they also then, after they did that, they then did a political element, which was taking a letter to 10 Downing Street to protest against 5 political agitators that had been garroted, executed by the Franco regime only 2 weeks before. Because Franco regime, even though Franco was pretty much dead 6 months before he actually died, he was on intensive care basically. His regime carried on being very, very heavy on the political side. But this photo is quite an interesting photo as well, because if we zoom in, we can see a couple of really interesting characters here. And the first character is this guy. This is Agustín Raventura, the guy I told you about. And he was an ardent anarchist, but he was very heavily involved in the trade unions, the TUC, and he was basically somebody who worked in printing, and I say he worked in the Sun, the Times. He then ended up working for W.H. Smith, so it's all really interesting stuff. But as I say, he ended up setting up, in fact, I've got the wrong person. Start again. That's him there. Sorry, that's Agustín Raventura there. And he ended up chronicling a lot of the stories of these men, because he met them all after the war. And he was part of a small team. Him and his lifelong friend, both another anarchist, they were in the same internment camp in France in 1939, Antonio Vargas. Antonio Vargas actually escaped from that camp and then ended up in North Africa, and then they met up again in Jelfa camp 3 years later. But him and Antonio Vargas and a few others ended up petitioning the Labour government in the autumn of 1945 to allow the Spaniards to stay in Britain, because apart from the ones who were in the number 1 Spanish company, these Special Air Service, Middle East Commandos, and a few others, everybody else had enlisted in other countries, and therefore they were going to be returned to those other countries. And of course, those who'd been interned, 700 plus men who'd been interned in camps in North Africa, they had nowhere to go. So those who ended up from North Africa in Britain at the end of the war wanted to stay in Britain because they had nowhere else to go. And he and Antonio Vargas and a few others were key to making that happen. But this photo is really interesting because of this guy here. This guy here is Luis Portillo, Michael Portillo's father. And Michael Portillo's father was an academic who fled from Spain at the end of the Spanish Civil War, crossed over the Pyrenees, and ended up in Britain, became a journalist, and worked with the foreign service of the BBC during the Second World War. And he was very left-wing leaning. His brothers weren't. They were on the other side. They were on the el otro bando, as they say in Spain. And basically he carried on fighting against the Franco regime in exile. And of course, Michael never followed his political leanings. And actually, when this photo is taken, Michael Portillo had just finished at university and was doing some sort of internship in the city. And of course, they were chalk and cheese. So when I have spoken to Michael Portillo about this, he didn't believe that this was the case. And then when I showed him the photo, he was like, oh, okay, all right, fair enough. So it's quite an interesting story there. Most of the Spaniards were not able to go back to Spain at all during the Franco regime. Most of them were able, if they were still alive, of course, were able to go back after Franco died. Some of them did go back during the Franco regime because they had British passports, so they could do that. but most of them decided to carry on their lives, settling down in Britain and becoming assimilated in British society. A lot of them became British citizens. Some of them didn't want to, and then got their Spanish citizenship back again after Franco died. So a really interesting story. So, in summary, we're talking 1,200 Spaniards serving in the British Army, in British Army uniform. Across the whole of the British Army, there are even Spaniards I've found now that served in Burma, in some elements of the infantry in Burma and things like that. So, they were pretty much everywhere. Eritrea, Somalia, things like that as well. So, some amazing stories. And of course, they kind of live amongst us, and their ancestors do as well. It's been quite an incredible thing. And of course, for me, it's really interesting being an army officer, because this also underlines the traditions that we have as an army of taking in people from other nations to serve in our armed forces. The fact that we were happy to do that, and the Spaniards were really proud of being members of the British Army says quite a lot. Not too happy on the French, but c'est la vie, as they say. But yeah, I mean, an incredible story, something that's worth telling, and it's really growing arms and legs at the moment. I've just had a newspaper article published in El País, the largest Spanish-speaking newspaper in the world, this morning. So I'm hoping that we can get this book translated into Spanish, get it out in Spain, and then hopefully keep on telling the story. So thank you for your time, and if you've got any questions, do fire away. Thank you. Okay.
What was the relationship between the French government and Franco in 1939? Because did Franco want the Republican soldiers back?
Yeah, so...
And did it change when Vichy?
Yeah, so it changed in some ways for the better and some ways for the worse. It depends where you were geographically situated at the beginning of the war and when Vichy was established. So a list of prisoners and a list of individuals was handed over to the French government. The French government did hand over some of those individuals, the most famous being Luis Companys, who was the president of Catalonia, who was then escorted across the border and 2 days later was shot. And that happened to several other Spaniards in that early period. Now, the interesting thing then is that in some ways, being in Vichy was not necessarily as bad as that, but it depends which way you look at it. So when the armistice was signed between France and Germany, France was divided into an occupation zone, which is the north and the west, basically, and then you had Vichy France. Now, if the Spaniards ended up in the Vichy France bit, they were a lot safer for a start. If they were in that occupation zone bit, they were immediately regarded initially as prisoners of war by the Germans, but then when Franco got in touch with them directly, they were then interned, and as is well documented, nearly 10,000 Spaniards were sent to Mauthausen concentration camp, and about 4,500 were killed in Mauthausen. And a lot of those were men who had been rounded up in that occupation zone and then ended up in concentration camps. So it's quite an interesting thing. But of course, Vichy also, what it did was it tried to get rid of undesirables by sending them to North Africa as well. And in some cases, that actually saved some of these individuals because they weren't handed over to the Germans instead. So there were Jews and there were other nationalities and very, very politically active Spaniards who were sent to North Africa, okay, in concentration camps, in horrendous conditions, but they weren't sent straight to concentration camps like some of those who had been in the occupation zone.
Why were they not sent back to Spain?
Good question. Don't know. Really good question, yeah. I mean, some were. Don't get me wrong. Some were in that occupation zone. In 1940. So we were talking, May, June 1940 to the end of 1940. There were a lot of Spaniards. A lot of the Spaniards in 185 Spanish Labour Company. Some of them were sent to Mauthausen, and some of them were sent back to Spain by the Germans. Just depended on where they were.
But Franco would have to feed them, and he was broke and they were starving, weren't they? So...
They were, but he had his own concentration camp set up, which carried on all the way through until 1949. Spain was under martial law until 1948-49, so that basically meant that Franco could do what the hell he wanted. He broke the Spanish economy. There was a famine, very famous famine, which was covered up, obviously, and Spain was totally broken. But ultimately, he had a whole series of concentration camps, labour colonies, etc., where he used prisoners of war. He even got those prisoners of war to build his own mausoleum. the Valley of the Fallen, which is what he was buried in until 3 years ago. So you can imagine 32,000 political prisoners building your grave. It's quite horrendous, really. Any more questions? Hi, Andy.
A bit of a self-introduction. Obviously, Tom Winchester and people like that, Spanish Civil War veterans, International Brigades set up Ossipee Park. Do you know if there are any actual Spaniards as part of that? Because there was a Dad's Army episode where there was...
Yeah, I know. No, I was talking to somebody about that the other day, actually. So it turns out that there may well have been some members of the Spanish Republican Army who fled directly to Britain at the end of the Spanish Civil War that were involved in that way. The problem is that they were at the higher echelons of the military or the political elite, and therefore they didn't get as heavily involved as they should have been. And a lot of the Spaniards who were in the British Army, they were pretty much all working class people. And so there was a big gap between the two. And the interesting thing is that group of Spaniards, we're probably talking about 800 or so, who end up in Britain at the beginning of the Second World War, who've come to Britain directly. Negrin, the Prime Minister of Spain, was one of them. He lived in Britain until 1945. And in 1945, they all leave. And that void is filled by these Spaniards who have joined the British Army, who've actually, in many ways, assimilated better into being British because they've been in British Army units. You know, they love their cups of tea and all of that kind of thing. And it's quite an interesting take and quite an interesting way of kind of looking at it in that way. But yes, there are some examples, definitely, of, like, for example, one of the sergeants for 6 months in the No. 1 Spanish company was an ex-brigader. So there were crossovers quite often. Of course, a lot of all of the members of the International Brigades were on hit lists. They were on watch lists, and if they declared or if it was clear that they had been in the International Brigades when they enlisted or volunteered, they were not allowed to. And I met 2 sons of International Brigaders at an event in Winchester on Tuesday because they're really fascinated by this. And they came, and both of their fathers served, and they both volunteered at the beginning of the Second War War. Were told we're not interested, but then they re-volunteered in 1942 and were allowed in because they didn't talk about their past at all. And of course, things had moved on quite a bit. There was a kind of more of a war of necessity by that stage. We needed, fighting men to fight battles for us. So yeah, quite an interesting thing. I mean, I can put you in touch with some of these people if you want. Yeah, no worries, Andy. I know. Yeah, he was like an advisor, wasn't he, writing that book? But I mean, if you're going to be talking about quite extreme, politically extreme people, Wintringham is he was a good leader of men in the Spanish Civil War, but very much left, Corbyn and then some. Yeah. So you can imagine in 1939 that probably didn't go down too well. Hi, question at the back.
Yeah, no, I was wondering, you talked about the guys having petitioned to come stay in the country.
Yep.
Did any of them actually stay in the army?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had a question about this the other day. Yes, there were. And there are several examples in the enlistment records, and you'll see that in the back of the book. I've listed every single soldier who joined the British Army, Spaniard, 1,072. Some of them don't have Spanish names, by the way, so don't get put off by that. But there's a few that have really weird names, like I said, Robert Bruce and people like that. But ultimately, yes, you're right. There are some who ended up having a career in the British Army. Yeah, and they transferred to other parts of the army. There are several examples. Royal Engineers, there's a few. Artillery, Army Catering Corps, Royal Army Ordnance Corps, Royal Signals, things like that. We're not talking about loads. We're talking about dozens, but we're not talking about hundreds. Hi.
Have you come across Spaniards in the other armed services?
Well, this is a good question. I got asked this question at the National Army Museum last Friday. The RAF didn't want them, even though there were over 180 qualified fighter pilots who volunteered to join the RAF. The RAF didn't want them. Don't forget, the Air Ministry was separate to the Army, so they could make their own decisions. There were several Spaniards who joined the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy. Quite a few joined the Merchant Navy after the liberation in Northern Africa. There's lots of examples of them working on ships, working out of Northern African ports in the Mediterranean in the second half of the war. And quite a few of them were on the transatlantic convoys and things like that. There are quite a lot of Spanish surnamed people who are listed as being killed in action on ships in the North Atlantic. Whether or not they're all Spanish, because they could be Sri Lankan, for example, because of the Portuguese link, some of the surnames are quite similar. That's another avenue of approach for me. And then, of course, you've also got quite a few of the Spaniards who ended up being involved in, I mean, probably one of the most famous Spaniards in the whole of the Second World War was Garbo. I don't know if you've heard of Garbo. Well, he was a Catalan. And he settled in Britain, and he was, probably the most successful spy in the Second World War. And I mentioned him briefly in the book as well. Thank you for your time. Have a great weekend.